Hey guys, what's going on? This is Adam Everett Miller with AEtutsPlus.com, and in today's tutorial, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the behind the scenes from a product that we worked on recently for GE called Plug It In. I'm going to be talking about how I created an extension cord as we set up for this project. We wrote it and got it approved, and the time came to film. And so I'm sure, as you already watched in the commercial above, we had to decide, are we going to actually film an extension cord, wreaking havoc on the city, or do we try to recreate that? How would we do that? And so that was kind of the big question. So I went out and tried to do a couple tests to see what would it even look like to have an extension cord, uh, you know, being dragged behind a car. And as you can see, it's not that exciting. It's kind of just a cord being dragged behind a car. So after trying a couple different things, I then tried to lock it off. So I tied one end of the cord to a pole, and I then stood over on the other side, and I just wiggled the cord to see what kind of a look that would get. And I was surprised to find that a, a static cord being wiggled actually looked more dynamic and more fun than a cord truly being dragged behind a car. Especially when I got into these little wiggles, stuff kind of like this, where you're seeing a lot of. Let me give a good example here. Yeah, where you're seeing a lot of these individual little jumps here. It almost looks like this is where the rope was coiled, and it's still got a kink in it. And so as the car is driving off, these kinks are being dragged behind. Obviously, that's not happening. The cord's not moving. This is the same section of cord going up and down. But after playing with it, I found that this really makes it look more like moving cord, like a cord's moving way more than the other thing does. So with this in mind, I jumped over into After Effects, and I thought, okay, how do I make a cord? Do I do it in Cinema 4D? Do I actually make a 3D model of a cord, or can I do it with a layer? What's the best way? And so I started playing around with Particular, and I'm going to show you what I got. Now this here is a shot that did not make the cut for a number of reasons. One, timing, but also just we didn't want to reveal the car driving out of the driveway with the cord. We wanted to kind of save that and have it be more of a big reveal. But this is a shot that I had worked on that did not make the commercial. So I figured I would let you guys play with it, and we can work on that today. The other reason is that this is one of the only shots where you can actually see the back of the car, so it kind of gives away the cheat a little bit that it's just a stream of particles because it's not in a locked position. All the other shots we used were kind of at an angle or from the front of the car a little bit, so you didn't see necessarily where the cord was connected to the back in theory. So that's another reason why. But more than focusing on the actual nitty-gritty of making this look like a 100% realistic shot, I'm more just going to walk through the basics of how I recreated this cord. So let's go ahead, and I'm just going to drop the shot into a new composition. And let me find where it kind of takes off, right about there. I'll hit B to bring in my beginning point, and N to bring in the bring up the end. Okay, so this is my shot. What I'm going to do right now, before I even get into anything, I'm just going to lock it right here. I'm going to hit time and freeze frame, okay? Just so that we can just focus on this angle, okay? By right-clicking, creating a new solid, I'm going to call this one Particles, okay? And I'm going to add Particular, okay, trap code Particular. Okay, next I'm going to create an emitter, because I did use a light emitter, so create a new light. We'll call it emitter. If you've ever used a light before, if you've ever used Particular before, this is nothing new. Go to emitter, and we're going to change it from point to light. Okay, so now our light is where all the particles are being emitted from. Okay, what I want to do with all these particles is basically I just want to make it so they're being emitted, but that's about it. No velocity, no movement at all. I just want it to be born and to stay put. Also, I want for it to be coming out of one exact point, like basically a 1 pixel point. So I don't want any Z depth or anything like that. I want it to stay right here. Okay. Skipping ahead, right now it's at 100 particles. 100 particles per second. That's fine for the time being. Let me come down here to physics, and where we're going to be controlling the direction and actually making the cord up here is they'll be emitted from one point, but then I'm going to use the wind here under physics. If you go to air and then you go down to wind, I can actually use the wind and push it out in a direction. So once they're being born, then they are being blown. So you can see here in the beginning, well, it's hard to see because there's so many particles, but it's being born and then it's being slowly pushed out. And this is exactly what we want. Go back here, go down to wind again. So I want to push them out in the Z direction pretty well there, and let's bring our light there. I want, and you can adjust all the factors here, the Z, the depth, and then also the Y going up and down, and then also the X left and right. So this looks pretty decent, but I think I can even crank it out more. Let's maybe knock this one to 2500. Oops, not 250. 2500. And accidentally open the new layer. Okay. And that looks pretty decent. I mean, obviously we'll point it up a ways and then over a ways. And that should be good. So now we have a very long lightsaber sort of thing being dragged by the back of this car, if it was dragging. Okay, the next thing we want to do is remember that when I had in order to create it, I needed to have a one locked off end, which this is going to simulate the locked off end, and then I was shaking up and down and spinning around the other end. So I need to take this emitter, and I'll hit P to bring up the position, Alt click, or Option click, and then I want to wiggle it. And remember, for wiggle, it's oh my, the expression is how often and how much. So how often, let's say maybe 5 times per second. So it's how many times per second, and then how much, let's say 40 pixels. So it's going to wiggle within 40 pixels 5 times every second. So let's take a quick look at that and see how it's looking. Okay, and obviously we don't have enough particles per second, so that's why we're seeing them kind of individually here as little dots. Okay, and this seems a little bit slow. So let's crank that up to maybe 7 or 8. Let's try 8 and see how that looks. And now this wiggle, just generically, this looks great, but if you take these individual elements, they'll look all right, but then when you actually put them in the final shot, we're going to have issues, and we'll come to that here in a second. But as is, you can see that this does not quite look good, just because it's squared corners, and we have all these random little dots, especially if I knock the resolution up to full. So going back to particles, first thing I want to do is I want to crank this up. So let's change it from 100 to 2000. And that's just going to fill in the gaps a lot more. So now it's emitting way more particles. Second thing I want to do is I want to smooth this out. So if you can go down to position subframe, change it to 10 times smooth. And that's just going to kind of round out each of these corners. So it looks more like a string rather than, blocky mathematical calculations. Okay, so now just hitting 0 really quick. It's looking a whole lot better. Okay, awesome. Next thing I want to do is, well, let's just drag this off frame. Okay, and let's go ahead and kill our time freeze and see what it's actually looking like with the shot. Okay, so it needs a second to catch up, but overall pretty good. The thing we want to watch is we want to make sure that our chord is not going way faster than the car itself, because if it's going at like 4,000, which we can do here really quick, let's say I take that and knock it up to 4,000, you'll see what happens is it's going to be shooting way past the car, and it's just not going to look realistic, because where the ripples are going is going faster than the way that the car is actually moving them. So let's bump that back down to 2,500, and it kind of looks like where the kink is staying with the car a little bit better, right? Looking at that again really quick here. Okay, cool. So now there's the obvious problem that the chord is kind of going over the car, and that is going to be an issue, and that is just an issue with creating this effect in this way that we're going to have to fix that here in a second. But before we do, let's go ahead and look at the color a little bit, because it's obviously quite white. So we'll go up here to particle. And one thing I was surprised at, you'd think extension cord, nice and bright and orange. I was surprised actually looking at the footage when I took the color picker here, how pink the extension cord turned up. So it actually had way more of a pink look than I was thinking. It was actually honestly more like this than it was bright orange. But This is just a tutorial, so let's make it more orange. And we don't want it too bright. This should do it. Right in there. Okay. So we got it. It's a solid color, but it still doesn't look like an actual chord. And this is where shading is going to come in. If we go to shading and we do shadow lit from main, we're going to turn that on. And instantly what it does is it creates a nice little shadows here within it. So there's kind of a highlighted spot and then a shadow on the bottom. Let's go here and do a shadow lit settings. We'll turn the color strength down to 50 because we don't want it to be that harsh. And then let's turn the opacity to 20. So it's a little bit stronger opacity, but the color is not quite as slappy in the face black. And so that'll give us a pretty decent little result there. Okay, and let's take a look at that and see how we're feeling. Not bad. We could probably even have it wiggle a bit more, like wider out than even 40. But that's fine. You can play with the wiggle settings as you please for your shot if you ever actually want to make a dragging extension cord. Okay, the next thing that we want to do to add realism here is we want to add a little bit of a blur. Particular by default, I'll show you here. So if I want to add a blur, my natural instinct is to give it a motion blur, turn my motion blur on, and then I would hit 0 and do a RAM preview. But the problem with this is that I get kind of almost this ovular, it doesn't look like a nice perfectly round chord as much anymore. It almost, as it's blurring it, the color and the shadow lit kind of affect it, and it doesn't turn up that noticeable in this shot, but there was other shots that I saw that were far worse, that it didn't look as clean of a chord. So what I ended up doing is, let's take the shadow lit off, I'm sorry, the blur off, and I'm just going to select both of these guys, and one more step to do before we do this. I just want to say this is kind of a bridge that we're going to cross here. We're going to pre-compose this. So if there's any other settings that you want to do, one thing that you could do, for example, is you set a keyframe for the emitter, and then over time you can kind of shift the emitter over to make it look like it's it's moving over if it's dragging something. So as you do that, then the cord can kind of drag over a little bit. Let me bring it in closer so you can see that. And it can change positions a little bit. Just another option, but I would recommend doing that before we pre-compose. So you have your option, it's all locked, ready to go. We'll take our particular and our emitter layer, and we will pre-compose those, and we'll just call them chord pre-comp. Okay, so we have our chord pre-comp, and of course I did forget one last thing. I'm just going to add a quick fast blur here to the particles, because they look a little bit crisp if you look at them compared to the footage here. They still look just a little clean, so let's go ahead and add just a quick fast blur, maybe 2. Let's see how that looks. Is that too soft? Maybe a touch too soft. Maybe just 1 will do it. Okay, just to soften it a hair and make it fit better. Okay, so now that we have this, what pre-composing is going to do is it allows us to then add a force motion blur, which will look for differences between pixels. So as there's motion, let me just turn it off and on again so you can see the difference. Normal, and then with a force motion blur added on there, it essentially simulates a motion blur. So as the footage and as the simulation changes from one clip to the next, it's going to blur that change and make it feel more lifelike. Okay, and it might be a little bit more noticeable here in the beginning. The other thing that's nice about pre-composing like this is that we now have a solid layer. If you were to try to mask a solid that has particular applied to it, and you start masking things out, it's going to be funky. But now it's pre-composed. It's essentially almost a rendered or locked video. So now that frees us up to mask out certain areas. So we want to get rid of this. Let's go ahead and duplicate our bottom footage. We will drag it on top. Lower the opacity a little bit so we can see what we're doing. And then we can create a little mask here just to get rid of, and turning it all the way up again, you can see that we're going to get rid of that edge. We can also feather it just a hair, maybe like 20 or so. Okay. And actually maybe even that's too much, maybe 10. Okay. Just enough so that it kind of blurs in. So now we want to animate our path. So we hit M, and let me just kind of power through this, and I'll speed it up. Okay, so now we have a basic example. I just kind of trimmed off the edges where the particles were still coming in, and then the end where they're not lined up perfectly. But again, this would be intended for a pretty fast shot that happens even in the actual final commercial. Most of these shots are less than a second long. But we're going to see that we have a pretty decent chord then draggy behind. Obviously not perfect with the keyframing, but you get the idea. The next thing that we want to do to add a little bit of realism to it is give it a drop shadow. Not an actual drop shadow, but a realistic shadow. You can see that the car has a shadow underneath it, and then the trees have shadows. So more than this car shadow, which is letting no light through, we're going to do more of a tree shadow just because yes, there's it's blocking the direct sunlight, but there's still just ambient light in the world. Whereas here under the car, it's pretty much pitch black. There's no light bouncing off. It's such a narrow opening that it's going to do that. It's going to completely block out all light. So what we can do is simply duplicate our chord pre-comp, and we'll call this one chord shadow. Okay, and then we're going to apply fill. And we'll just apply that right on top. Okay, it's going to fill it with a red by default. Let's go ahead and change it to black. And I want to drag it below this guy. Now, as we move forward here, this is a pretty straight on shot. Most of the other shots were kind of done at an angle, so it's a little bit easier. This one might not be as easy, but all I really want to do is just offset it a little bit. So even if that just means kind of lowering it or moving it to a side. In this case, I think it looks like the shadows are kind of coming from over in this direction and going this way. So even if I kind of move it over, this should suffice. And if you want to, you can also kind of distort it just a hair, maybe stretch it out that way, because you can see that the trees are, you don't need to get too intricate with it, but by just distorting it, playing with it a little bit, you should be able to get a somewhat decent result. We're just gonna check it really quick. Now it's the exact same thing, but just with this little offset, it kind of makes it look as though there is a shadow below it, and especially as we blur it here. Okay, and that might be a little too much to offset. Let's bring it back in just a hair. Okay, so yeah, let's go ahead and add. Well, before we blur it, let's do this. One thing that's true is a shadow. You can't have a shadow on top of another shadow. Oops. I mean, you can, but we do it right there. But with this sort of thing, realistically, the light would be shining down, and we would be getting a shadow, or we would be seeing this tree shadow on top of the chord. I didn't take it to that extreme because I didn't think people would care. But one thing that is quite noticeable is even if I try to take my fill here, and I take this color and try to match it a little bit with the same gray as the pavement, just so I see it there and I see it on the back end, there's still a noticeable section if I were to kind of solo these two. There's still a noticeable section where there is a shadow essentially over another shadow. And I want to get rid of that. So I'm going to duplicate my background one more time. Again, laying it on top. And let's bring this back to, I can solo these. I don't need to see the other stuff. I want to bring this back to black just so I can kind of see what I'm doing a little bit easier. Okay. And let me shadow right there. And bring this, let me call this shadow overlay. And it's these little details that I think are really gonna, help sell the realism that this is an actual chord. All right, so with this done, let's go ahead and just kind of pen out this area, and we can feather it a bunch. And I'm just gonna do this bottom one. I'm not even gonna focus on that up there right now. So. We'll set a mask path. Let me just keyframe a little bit. Right there. Let me back up just a little bit here. And I don't even need to worry about it after this point. This is when it really kind of comes in. So anything before there isn't really as relevant. bring up the chord, or the mask feather. I can do 20, and that should suffice if I leave it alone here. Okay, so I'll take that off. And now I want to take my shadow chord and let's drop it back to where it was, kind of this nice gray. Right here. Okay, and then the overlay, I want to turn all the way back up again. So it completely masks that out. So then as time goes on, it's going to, this shadow still has the, still has the same blur, still has the same movement and everything. The only difference is then it's just not showing up in the actual shadow here. It is of course there, but in this area, if I were to take our main chord off, it's going to avoid that area right there, which is pretty fun. Let's feather that just a bit more, and I'm going to actually bring the mask expansion in just a little bit, and that might be way too much to feather. Okay. The other big thing is it's still a little noticeable, but when I take the actual chord, I'm going to give it a fast blur. Fast blur on the chord shadow, and we just crank that up considerably. Not too crazy much, but enough. And then also just lower the opacity of it in general. So let's knock it down to like 30, or maybe not that much, but just like 50. I mean, you barely want to notice it. This shouldn't be a big thing that stands out. It should just be a little bonus thing that you see chilling underneath there. And this whole chord is a bit too bright right now. So, compositing that is another factor. Let's just add maybe a tint here and desaturate it just a little bit. Just a bit to make it composite, a little bit more natural into the final shot. And you would need to adjust your masks here, but I'm just trying to show you at least where that, where the shadow overlays. So let me see, is there anything else that I wanted to mention? If there's any other objects that would go in front of the mask, or I'm sorry, in front of the chord, you would need to mask those out. But overall, if you look at the spot, let me just bring that back up again. There are all sorts of different ones. So, for example, in this shot coming up right here, I had to cut out these guys. You can see the shadow underneath. It took a lot of effort and a lot of I applied the mesh warp a few times just to make sure that I kept my chord, right there, kind of locked in that one position. But I had to cut out each of the twins' heads. Added motion blur. I had to cut out the cars. And I really honestly alternated between a real chord shot and a fake chord shot. We went back and forth, and I think it was that alternating that kind of kept you wondering what's real and what's fake. So this one was fake. This one was obviously real because it was easy to do. This one was fake, real. Then this one was fake. Pretty much anything that was really super wide and would have been difficult to film, like this one, it's hard to see in this small version. But then the big one that we, really the ultimate reason why we created this in general was for this shot here at the end, where there's just no way. We thought about, okay, what if we throw the chord at the camera? It's just not going to happen. So essentially what I did is, just like what we did with this shot going away from the camera, I just did the opposite thing. I took the emitter and stuck it way back here in Z space, and I had it shoot towards the camera. And when it started flying really fast towards the camera, that motion blur really kind of helped carry it a little bit, and it really made it stand out. There was a big difference there. So anyway, I hope this was enjoyable for you guys. I have no idea when you're going to use this, but I figured it might be a little interesting just to see a few of the steps that I took in order to pull off the effects in this spot. My name is Adam Everett Miller with AEtutsPlus.com, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.